Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. And tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 10, and we're going to cover types of assault. Also, a quick reminder, don't forget to utilize those resources at the end of each chapter. And again, those student resources will definitely help you as it relates to your weekly quizzes and also your chapter exams as well. So with that being said, let's jump right into Chapter 10 and talk about assaults. And we're going to cover quite a bit of information in this particular chapter. So this might be another one of those chapters where it would be a great idea that you read your textbook or your chapter thoroughly so you can have a better understanding of some of the things that we're going through this evening. So we're going to start with simple assault found in Penal Code or under Penal Code 240. And simple assault is defined as an unlawful attempt to commit battery coupled with present ability to commit violent injury on a person. Now, again, the three elements necessary here for assault are going to be the unlawful attempt to commit the battery, the present ability, and also to commit violent injury on a person. Now, Penal Code 241A shows us the punishment: fine not exceeding $1,000 or imprisonment in the county jail not exceeding 6 months or both. And if an assault is committed against what we call a special class of individuals, the punishment is higher. It actually doubles. So as I've explained in other chapters about a lot of these sections, you need to take the time to look at the elements and make sure that you have a good understanding of what these mean. So when we look at things like an unlawful attempt, what's unlawful? And present ability, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to have present ability? Or violent injury? What is that? So the good part about the law is the code sections tell us a lot of this information. So when you look at unlawful, you have to remember not all assaults are unlawful. Self-defense against an assailant, for example, is legal. The necessary force used in making a lawful arrest is also legal. The acts of force used in various athletic events, hockey, boxing, football, those are examples of legal assaults. Now, when you look at the present ability means that the act attempted is physically capable of being carried out by that suspect or by that assailant. It means that so far as the assailant is personally concerned, the methods he or she intends to use and the manner in which he or she threatens or intends to use them will, in fact, inflict that intended injury. Does that make sense? So such present ability relates solely to the ability of the person attempting the unlawful injury. It doesn't refer to the fact that by some reason or condition not controlled by the suspect, if you will, that the intended injury can't be inflicted. So I think that kind of clears it up a little bit. And then violent, what is violent injury? Does that mean it has to be some massive injury on somebody, or could it be something else? The words violent injury, as used in defining the crime of assault, do not mean that the injury attempted must be a severe one or cause great physical pain, but merely mean the unlawful application of physical force upon the person of another. The terms violence and force are synonymous when used in relation to assault and include the application of force even though it entails no pain or bodily harm, or in fact doesn't even leave a mark. So just kind of a quick review, because it's always good to go over these things twice. Not all assaults are unlawful. We talked about self-defense and sporting contests, etc. Assault is an attempt crime. It's an attempt to commit a battery. It's a general intent crime. So when you talk about battery, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, this assault is basically an attempted battery. And I'll clear that up a little bit in a little bit from now. The assailant or the suspect must have presentability to commit the crime, meaning that they're physically capable of carrying out this crime. And violent injury doesn't mean to severely injure, it merely means the unlawful application of force. So what about those special classes that we talked about? Remember, we talked earlier about, hey, if an assault is committed against a special group of individuals, then the punishment might be a little bit higher, or double, if you remember. So Penal Code 241 talks about those special classes against whom an assault carries a more severe penalty. So the legislature has made it a more serious offense to assault certain classes of persons while such persons are engaged in the performance of their duties, meaning that they have to be at work doing their regular job. These laws were passed in response to an increase in public and group violence and riot-like activities, and used as problem-solving or attention-getting techniques by some groups. But the groups you can see here are, well, before you. So they're peace officers, firefighters, EMTs, custodial officers, teachers, cab drivers or bus drivers, jurors, or those members of the armed forces. Now, remember, the elements of assault against these certain classes of persons would be the same as for any other assault, with the exception of three things. So I don't think I have a slide for that, so I'm going to kind of go through it. So number one, the person assaulted must be a peace officer, firefighter, paramedic, school teacher, administrator, security officer, bus driver, etc. Somebody on the list. Number two, the person assaulted must be engaged in the performance of his or her duties at the time of the assault. And then finally, number three, the assailant knows or reasonably should have known that the victim is one of these classes of persons named. Example, police officer. Now, an example you could kind of throw in there, if you're in full uniform with the badge and the belt and the gun and all the other stuff like that, it's pretty easy for you to have a case there that somebody should have known that you were, in fact, a law enforcement officer. So we talked about assault. Now, what about battery? And you know what? Before we move on to battery, I want to finish up one little quick thing on assault. And again, it might be a little repetitive, but that's okay, because I want to make sure that you really understand the difference here. So where the unlawful attempt to injure another has been made, the fact that the assailant or the suspect failed in his attempt or was prevented or desisted from actually inflicting the injury he was attempting does not affect his guilt, because this is an assault. If he actually hits you and they're striking, it's going to be a battery, and we'll see how that works. The attempt to injure in many cases of assault is usually very evident, especially when the actual injury results. So when we get into the next topic here and we talk about battery, if somebody commits a battery against somebody, there is going to be an assault already, because the assault is the attempted battery. Does that kind of help a little bit? And I really hope that it does kind of clear up a couple of things. Well, battery now is found under Penal Code Section 242. And battery is rather simply defined as any willful an unlawful use of force or violence upon the person of another. Now, battery includes and implies an assault, for there can be no battery without an assault. But remember, there can be an assault without a battery, right? Battery is a completed assault, and the offense of simple assault is a necessarily included offense where battery is charged. Now, yes, I know it sounds like a bunch of legalese, but hang with me. So what are the essential elements for battery? Any willful and unlawful use of force or violence on the person of another. And we're going to go back in a minute and we're going to look, because remember, we need to know what willful and unlawful means. And what does force or violence mean? And we'll go back and we'll take a look at that, but let's finish up right here. Punishment for battery, 243A, fine not exceeding $2,000 or imprisonment in county jail not exceeding 6 months or both. Remember, if committed against special classes, the maximum jail term for battery is going to be 1 year. And battery is a completed assault, and assault is, in fact, a lesser and included offense of battery. Now, when we talk about those terms, remember in there, we know that willful and unlawful. Let's take a look at those two things that we need to kind of define further. The term willful and unlawful simply means the act was not an accident. General or constructive intent will suffice here, as will gross negligence. So you have to kind of think about it. So those words, remember, willful and unlawful, it's not accidental. So if I accidentally bump into you, then we have to kind of take that in its context, and it really wouldn't fall underneath the battery section, but I'll give you some examples in a moment. And then force. So remember, we're looking at willful and unlawful, and then use of force or violence. The amount of force applied is immaterial here. Okay? The force or violence need not cause pain, injury, or even leave a mark. And some other unique examples that we're going to see of battery could include some things that maybe you don't think of. So to help differentiate between assault and battery, it has often been said that if one takes a swing at another and he misses, he has committed an assault. Well, that's true. If he connects with the other person, it would be a battery. Now, some other examples would be spitting on someone else, running into them with a bicycle, squirting them with water, slapping somebody in the face, shoving another off the sidewalk. Now, note here that the amount of force used is not too important, except that causing very serious injury or using dangerous or deadly force can result in a more serious charge, of course, and increased punishment. But there are, accidents. If it's an accident, you'll be able to figure it out. But if it's willful, on purpose, or unlawful, that means it's not accidental and therefore would qualify as a battery. Well, and those are typically misdemeanors. Well, what about felonies? What are the circumstances where the charge would go from, say, a misdemeanor to a felony or something like that? Well, felony battery, or battery is a felony wobbler when committed upon specified officers and emergency personnel while they are on duty. And it's also a felony when the battery causes great bodily injury. So when committed against special classes, and we know what those people are or who those people are on the list, you can find that in section 243C. An example would be battery with injury on a police officer performing his or her official duty when the suspect should have reasonably known that the victim was a peace officer in performance of their duty, is a wobbler, carrying a maximum $10,000 fine and up to 3 years in jail. So you can see the penalty definitely enhances. When the battery causes great bodily injury, section 243D. So a couple of different sections there. And then sexual battery. So a lot of times it may not be an assault for some type of physical force, striking type issue, but the intent could be something different. So section 243.4 states any person who touches an intimate part of another while that person is unlawfully restrained by the accused or an accomplice, or is institutionalized or disabled, or is unconscious of the nature of the act because of the suspect's fraudulent misrepresentation that the touching serves a professional purpose, and if the touching is against the will of the person touched and is for the purpose of sexual arousal, gratification, or abuse, that would make the person guilty of sexual battery, and that would also be a felony wobbler section. So we've talked about, assault is, unless it's on under certain circumstances or against certain individuals, is a misdemeanor. Battery would kind of be the same thing. We've given you a couple of felony battery sections to look at, and now we're going to look at what they call felony battery with great bodily injury. And you'll be able to see how the code tells you what is defined under serious bodily injury. So section 243D is battery with great bodily injury. This occurs when a physical injury requires some type of medical or professional treatment. And serious bodily injury is defined under 243 subsection F subsection 4 as loss of consciousness, a concussion, a bone fracture, an impairment of the body, a wound requiring extensive stitching or suturing, or any type of serious disfigurement. And we already talked about sexual battery a little bit, but one thing to kind of add to that, so we know what the elements of sexual battery are, but remember, a lot of times we have to ask ourselves the question, well, when it talks about touching the intimate part of another, what is the intimate part? And for us to maybe prosecute a case on that, we're going to need to know that. So we know the elements include touching an intimate part of another against their will, while restrained by the suspect or someone that's helping an accomplice for purpose of sexual arousal or gratification. And the intimate part that's described here would be sexual organ, anus, groin, buttocks of any person, or the breast of a female. So it helps us break out all of that information. So now that we know what an assault is and a battery is and a felony battery and sexual battery and all of that, are you allowed to defend yourself? And how does that kind of play in the realm of law enforcement? So we're going to look at what we call the lawful resistance to crime, aka or also known as self-defense. Now, Penal Code section 692 talks about self-defense. You can also look at 693 and 694, but 692 basically says lawful resistance to the commission of a public offense may be made by the party about to be injured or by other parties. And when an attack is sudden and personal danger is imminent, a person may stand their ground and subdue their attacker. This is so even if the person can gain safety by flight. So what they're telling us here is that you don't have to run away in order to gain safety. You have or can, by code and by law, if there's an attack that is very sudden and there is personal danger and that is imminent, you can stand your ground and subdue the attacker. Okay, but along with that, you have to understand you're going to be judged based on how you subdue your attacker on a level of what they call reasonableness, and I'll get to that in a second. Now, deadly force can only be used when subjected to a life-threatening or serious bodily harm, not just danger. Okay, so you can't, if you just feel like you're in danger, you can't break out a Louisville Slugger and beat somebody to death, basically, when you're only just in that area of danger. There needs to be life-threatening or serious bodily harm. So a little bit more discussion here. A person cannot set up their own standard of reasonableness or belief of injury or the amount of force necessary. He or she is limited to that which the ordinary, reasonable, and prudent person placed in the same position would be warranted in considering reasonable and necessary under the circumstances, meaning that that reasonableness standard is going to be used to judge you on how you may have stood your ground as it relates to self-defense. So hopefully that kind of clears that up and you have a better understanding about that. So also kind of falling underneath the umbrella of types of assaults would be not just when you use hands and fists and things like that, but also weapons. So Section 417 of the Penal Code talks about exhibiting a deadly weapon. Now, the more legal definition is as follows. So except in self-defense, every person who draws, meaning pulls out, or exhibits, meaning displays or shows, any firearm, whether loaded or unloaded, or any other deadly weapon in a rude, angry, or threatening manner, or who unlawfully uses such weapon in a fight or quarrel, is guilty of a misdemeanor. Now, note, this section covers the use of any deadly weapon, okay, not just a firearm. So also, a firearm in this particular section does not have to be loaded, because the other person wouldn't know that. If you displayed a firearm, most people would probably assume that it's loaded and therefore increase that fear factor because people just don't know. But for purposes of this particular section, the gun doesn't have to be loaded. Now, again, classified as a misdemeanor unless done in the presence of a police officer, and then it is in fact a felony. So there are also other sections that fall under the different types of assault, and you can find those in your textbook starting, I believe, on page 161 and going to page 162. We talked about Penal Code 417, exhibiting a firearm in a threatening manner. And then there's 417C, which talks about doing the same thing in the presence of a police officer. Well, there are a couple of other interesting sections that are there. Firearm drawn at a motor vehicle, and meaning that it's brandished or pointed. Pointing a laser, which has its own section. And an interesting one, exhibiting a firearm replica. So section 417.4. Kind of an interesting section, so I thought I would take just a minute and go over it. So first of all, pointing a laser, aiming, pointing a laser scope or laser pointer at another in a threatening manner with the intent to cause fear of bodily harm is a misdemeanor. Now, if the victim is a peace officer and the perpetrator should have known this, the jail term maybe up to 6 months for the first offense or 1 year for a subsequent offense. The firearm replica is very interesting. It is a misdemeanor except in self-defense to draw or exhibit a firearm replica in a threatening manner against another person in such a way as to cause a reasonable person fear of bodily harm. Now they go on to define what a replica is. Means any device with the apparent capability, doesn't mean it has to, apparent capability, so you have to read the words, of expelling a projectile by force of air or explosion, and which is reasonably perceived by the victim as an actual firearm. Now this definition would include, of course, things like blank guns or starter pistols or maybe even BB guns. So it's that perception of the victim that kind of brings that section out. So we've looked at some assault, different types of assault sections, and now we're gonna move into, I guess, the higher level assault section, assault with a deadly weapon. You can find it in our Penal Code section 245. Every person who commits an assault upon another person with a firearm or other deadly weapon, now look at the words, or instrument, or by any means of force likely to produce great bodily injury. It doesn't say that it has to, okay, or with a firearm, is guilty of a felony. And the penalty is more severe if the weapon used is in fact a firearm, and the penalty is also more severe if the victim is in fact a police officer or firefighter engaged in the performance of their duties. Now, you have to go back up and look at the section again. Deadly weapon or instrument. Well, we can probably figure out some things that we could classify that could be a deadly weapon, like a big knife or a dagger or maybe even a pair of scissors or something like that, or a firearm, and it talks about firearm. But what about a baseball bat? Could that be a deadly weapon in this case? The answer would be, well, I'm pretending that there's music playing in the background as we're going on. I hope you said yes, because really if you struck somebody 15 times in the head with a baseball bat, while it's not sold as a deadly weapon, could it be a deadly weapon? Well, yes. Well, that's why they put instrument in there. Could a golf club qualify? What about somebody wearing steel-toed boots and they kick someone in the face 15 or 25 times and break their jaw and break their eye socket? Could that be a deadly weapon? The answer would be yes. So again, reading these sections and really trying to understand them is very, very important as it relates to making sure that you have what you need in order to prosecute people for these particular crimes. And then a couple of other interesting sections before we start to wrap things up a little bit would be hazing, 245.6. It is a misdemeanor to engage in initiation hazing at an educational institution, and I think they did this because of the amount of people that were getting hurt. If death or serious bodily injury results, the crime is a felony wobbler. Well, how about this one? This is super interesting. HIV exposure. So it's not a penal code. It's found in the Health and Safety Code 120291. So let's look at the section. Any person who exposes another to HIV during unprotected sex with the specific intent to infect is guilty of a felony. So you have to show that specific intent. And remember, a lot of times the codes will tell you if there needs to be specific intent. So how would you prove that? Maybe by inferences of actions of the suspect, maybe by something they wrote down or said, or circumstantial evidence or whatever, but you would have to show specific intent in order for this particular section to work. Assault with caustic chemicals, there's kind of another interesting section there. Every person who willfully and maliciously places or throws or causes to be placed or thrown upon the person of another any corrosive acid, flammable substance, caustic chemical of any nature with the intent to injure the flesh or disfigure the body of such person is punishable in the state prison. Now, there again, specific intent to either injure the flesh or disfigure the body must be proven as an independent factor if you want assault with caustic chemicals to be there. Now, if you don't have that specific intent, of course, it could qualify maybe as a different crime under a different section, but for this section, you're going to need the specific intent. Well, how about poisoning? Is that an assault? Well, actually, it certainly is. So, any person who willfully mingles any poison, meaning like mixes or adds, any poison or harmful substance with any food, drink, or medicine, or who willfully places any poison or harmful substance in any public water supply where the person knows or should have known that the same would be taken by any human being to his or her injury is in fact guilty of a felony punished by imprisonment in the state prison. And there's a couple of in your textbook also, there's a lot of other assault sections that they kind of list here: throwing substances at vehicles like rocks or things like that, shooting at aircraft, shooting into inhabited dwellings, discharging a firearm in a dangerous manner, willfully discharging a firearm in a grossly negligent manner that could result in injury or death to a person is a felony. How about on New Year's Eve where everybody shoots up in the air and you know that bullet has to come down somewhere? So these are other basic types of assaults that have their own section, if you will. And then there's assault to commit certain felonies. There are certain crimes to where the crime actually may not be totally carried out or completed, but yet the person's actions dictate their specific intent to do any one of these types of crimes or their acts. So let's kind of take a look at it. So assault with intent to commit certain felonies, and the elements include doing any direct or ineffectual act with specific intent to. So Penal Code 220 is the section you want to know. Every person who assaults another with intent to commit mayhem, rape, sodomy, oral copulation, or any violation of section 264.1, 288, or 289 is punishable by imprisonment, in the state prison, and the elements are doing any direct or ineffectual act, again with specific intent. Now, there must exist in the mind of the assailant at the time of the attack that specific intent to commit one of the crimes that are specified that I just read, and this intent must be proven as one of the elements of the crime. How about administering stupefying drugs? Every person guilty of administering to another any chloroform, ether, laudanum, or any controlled substance, anesthetic, or intoxicating agent with the intent thereby to enable or assist him or herself or any other person to commit a felony is guilty of a felony under Penal Code Section 222. And we're not going to talk about train wrecking. There have been a lot, it is a section, it is built in there, but we're going to kind of go past it because it doesn't happen too often, and we're almost to the end of our section, so just a couple other things to kind of clear up. So mayhem is defined under section 203, every person who unlawfully and maliciously deprives a human being of a member of his body, or disables, disfigures, or renders it useless, or cuts or disables the tongue, or puts out an eye, or slits the nose, ear, or lip, is guilty of mayhem under this particular section. And then more severe than that would be section 205, which would be what they call aggravated mayhem. So several chapters back, we kind of looked at some sections that had abandonment. So can you actually like abandon an assault? Can you not do it? Meaning, can you start to do it but then not do it? And this is kind of a difficult question to ask, and the answer is found in People versus Jones. So where the acts of a person have proceeded to the point of amounting in law to an assault, the abandonment by the suspect of his purpose before he has accomplished the object for which the assault was committed does not free him from the consequences of his act. Now, I know that's very legalese-ish. A defendant is guilty of the assault whether he voluntarily ceases his attack or whether he desisted because of the resistance of his intended victim or because of the approach of other parties permitting the victim to escape. So again, a defendant is guilty of the assault whether he voluntarily stops his attack or whether he stops because of the resistance of his intended victim, meaning they fight back, or because somebody else might approach, which means the victim can now escape. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then, with every crime is going to come forth possibly some type of justification or maybe even an excuse. If the use of force, even though it involves an intent to commit physical injuries upon another, is lawful, there really is no assault. Now, the law allows for a person to commit certain acts which would ordinarily be considered unlawful, but under certain conditions are not unlawful, either because of the law or public policy. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So self-defense actually is one of those things. And then finally, we're going to finish with domestic violence and talk about section 273.5, which defines domestic violence. The section really is called corporal injury upon a spouse or cohabitant, and the elements include willful infliction of corporal injury on a spouse or cohabitant resulting in a traumatic condition. Now remember, you may have to go back and look at what does willful mean, and what is corporal injury, and spouse or cohabitant, or traumatic condition. So again, while these are the elements, the code will further define some of these things for you to help you out. So a cohabitant is defined by the case People versus Hollifield and includes some permanency of a relationship, and traumatic condition is defined both in 273.5 subsection C and the case People versus Abrego, and means a condition of the body such as a wound or external or internal injury, whether of minor or serious nature, caused by physical force. And don't forget that under domestic violence, under Penal Code Section 18250, police officers must take custody of firearms seen in plain view or found during a lawful search. Penal Code 679.05 tells us that a victim must be advised orally or in writing of the right of a domestic violence advocate and a support person of the victim's choosing during an interview by law enforcement that can be an attorney. And Penal Code Section 273.6 talks about any intentional and knowing violation of a domestic violence protective order that basically is a misdemeanor if somebody violates that protective order. And those protective orders, a lot of times officers will assist the victims in getting a protective order, and that's the reason they have that section, is because a lot of times the suspect will violate that order and the officers in turn can then arrest somebody based on the violation of that order. Also falling into and under some types of assault would be child abuse reporting. Section 11166 tells us that healthcare practitioners, educators, police officers, and a list of other designated persons, and I'm not going to go through all of those individuals, are required by law to make a report if they know or reasonably suspect a child is a victim of physical or sexual abuse or neglect. And failure to make a mandatory report is in fact a misdemeanor. And again, there are a lot of other sections that fall underneath the domestic violence area, each with their own code section, and you can look at those at your leisure. And then for many years, the state of California has had a statute addressed to aid the victims of violent crimes. However, less than 1% of victims have availed themselves of financial relief through the statute. For this reason, the state legislature enacted a couple of different government codes, 13959 and 13968C, which would help those individuals deal with damages, legal fees, and personal property loss. So that's going to be it for Chapter 10, types of assaults. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to post them on the discussion board. If you don't want to put them there, you can also email me. And then one last reminder, don't forget about the student resources located at the end of your chapter. So that is it for tonight, and until next time.